Now, finally, before we move to our feature story for tonight, @AbdulXYZ comments on the current situation in Burma for the Rohingya Muslims, tweeting, "Accept ethnic reclassification or be detained, Burma's plans for the Rohingya Muslims." And that's exactly the story that our reporter Sarah Sehay has been following.
Accept ethnic reclassification and the prospect of citizenship, or be detained. This is the bleak choice that the Rohingya Muslim ethnic minority in Burma may be facing in the not-too-distant future, according to a new Reuters investigation. According to the news agency, the government's draft plan proposes that Rakhine authorities construct temporary camps in required numbers for those who refuse to be registered as Bengali and those without adequate documents. The problem is that many Rohingya do not have the required documents because they were lost during widespread violence in 2012, where deadly clashes with Buddhists displaced 140,000, mostly Rohingya people. Many also refuse to register themselves as Bengalis because they say that the term implies they are illegal immigrants from neighbouring Bangladesh, when many Rohingya families have lived in Rakhine for generations. Earlier this year, almost all Rohingya were excluded from a United Nations-backed census after refusing to list their identities as Bengali. The Burmese government does not recognise the existence of the Rohingya ethnicity and has to date refused to grant the majority of them citizenship. Most of Burma's 1.1 million Rohingya already live in apartheid-like conditions in western Rakhine. Burma has come under increasing international pressure over its treatment of the Rohingya, despite winning some praise for political and economic reforms introduced since military rule ended in March 2011. The draft plan says that the authorities would request the UN Refugee Agency to resettle illegal aliens elsewhere. But rights advocates warn that this could potentially put thousands of Rohingyas, including those living in long-settled villages, at risk of indefinite detention. According to Medea Savary, a spokeswoman for the UN Refugee Agency, it is unlikely that the detained people will be assisted in resettlement, as they would not be recognised refugees who have fled persecution and conflict across international borders. This development signals a worrying and uncertain future for the Burmese minority, who are in an ever-increasingly vulnerable position. Sarah Say, The Report.
With me in the studio now to discuss this is Mark Farmaner, Director of the Burma Campaign UK, and on Skype, joining us from Bangkok, Lilianne Fan, Research Fellow with the Humanitarian Policy Group, and welcome to the programme. This is a kind of bureaucratic ethnic reclassification. Is the worry that it'll end to not so bureaucratic ethnic cleansing?
Well, I think that's certainly the fear of Rohingya people that we've spoken to about this, is that being forced to basically say that they are Bengali immigrants when many of them have lived in Burma for many generations, they see as a step towards the goal that the President Thein Sein has said he wants, and which opposition leaders have said as well, which is to deport all Rohingya. So while this is being spun as a sort of what they're calling a pathway to citizenship, the Burmese government's claiming this as a way of trying to appease the international community. In fact, many Rohingya fear it's actually the opposite is the case, and it's a way they know very well that most Rohingya cannot provide documents, not just because of the violence that took place 2 years ago where documents are destroyed, but violence and the lack of documentation provided by the government for decades. To be a full citizen, you need documentation tracing your ancestry back to past 1823. It's a bizarre system of classifications that they have for citizenship based on how long you or your ancestors have been in the country and which specific ethnic group you're from. So, and it's deliberately designed to be complicated and confusing, because that helps them target the people they want to target.
Lilianne, is that the way you read it? Is this, rather than being a pathway to citizenship, is this a pathway to statelessness?
I mean, I think it very much is. I would definitely agree with Mark's analysis on this and the fears that many Rohingya have actually about this plan, because it seems that it really isn't. It really isn't going to help many of many people in this population at all. Many Rohingya gain any kind of pathway to citizenship. I think, what we have seen actually is that there's been a very small number of Rohingya Muslims who have been granted citizenship, but the number is so tiny, and the procedures around that are also not actually entirely clear. So I think that what you will see is very small numbers of people. The other day there was an announcement that 40 Rohingya out of, I think it was about 200 Muslims, had been granted citizenship. But this is a population of 1 million that you're talking about. So even if you have very small numbers, which will somehow be announced, as proof that this can be that it actually intends to be a pathway to citizenship, I think the reality, as we've heard, it is really something very different, and it's not just about institutionalizing even further that status of citizenship, but I think it's even more sinister than that, which is actually a very blatant attempt to segregate even further, detain and eventually actually deport this population, which is of course completely against international norms and standards. But I think what it says as well is that the expectation that the international community is somehow going to help the authorities implement this plan, it just points to a real misunderstanding of the role of the international community and also of international norms and standards.
Do you think that there's going to be a reaction, though? Because, they've got away with a lot of this without there being exactly a huge outcry in the international community, so-called. So do you think there will be a response from the international community over this, Lilianne?
Well, I think there has been. It hasn't been a very public one. This plan was presented to the international community a few months ago, actually. So it's only that it's just now come out into the media. And it's on the government side, it's actually presented as a comprehensive plan, if you like, in the way that they've designed this. And it actually has 6 objectives to it, so it's not just about citizenship assessment. It's also supposed to be about livelihoods. It's supposed to be about restoring, the rule of law. It's about very kind of broad ambitions of somehow having this process contribute to a tolerant and peaceful society. So there are a whole range of objectives that are being stated in this plan, and citizenship assessment is one of them. And that's where you have, these details about, the detention, in fact, building of temporary camps and detention of people who do not fall into the classifications under the 1982 citizenship law, which most of the Rohingya will not.
Okay, so Mark, that sounds like pretty frightening stuff. What's happened is frightening. This sounds like pretty frightening stuff. President Obama's due in the country shortly. Is he going to say anything?
Well, that's something I've been talking to colleagues in the US about, and it shows just how bad things have got, that what we're hoping for now is that he will at least use the word Rohingya, because the Burmese government has been very successful in its lobbying of the international community and the UN and pressuring them in the last year. So you had a situation where US Secretary of State went to Burma, didn't use the word. Tom Malinowski, who works for the State Department and whose remit is human rights, went and didn't use the word Rohingya. You've seen the UN now have stopped, even the UNHCR, which used to regularly use the word in its statements, now is not using the word Rohingya. And so this is a result of Burmese government pressure.
Why? Why has it been so successful?
I think for the Burmese government, they have been trying to present this as a controversial term, and the international community needs to be neutral on this issue. But it's not a question of neutrality, it's a question of international law. It's the standard international norm that people have the right to their own ethnicity and identity. And it's actually taking the side of the Burmese government to stop using the word Rohingya, because they are denying this ethnicity even exists. So when you have the US officials going there, European Union officials not using the word Rohingya, they are going along with this government policy of trying to deny the ethnicity and the existence of the Rohingya. And that's very serious, because if it's going the other way, if all these things that have happened, this downward spiral in Burma with first the violence, we've seen the rejection of international demands to amend the citizenship law, the international community is now dropping that demand largely. You've got the whole series where the international community is now the one that is stepping back, even though the situation for the Rohingya is getting much worse. They're taking the pressure off. And the more they take the pressure off, the more assertive the Burmese government gets about achieving its goals relating to the Rohingya. So it's not looking very hopeful at all. And when Obama goes, people are hoping he would just use the word Rohingya. Once we would have been hoping that he would say that changing the policy on the Rohingya within Burma would be conditional on the US having closer relations with the country.
Lilianne, I mean, how does that work when, and as we saw in the report, even in the census, so many of those people simply refuse to register as anything else? I mean, how does that argument carry that weight, even with the UN, when it's pretty clear that the people on the ground think differently?
Well, I think it's a real dilemma. I mean, it's partly a dilemma on the international community side of how to deal with this issue, and I think it's also partly fragmentation, which is not helpful when it comes to dealing with this issue. So on the dilemma side, I think for humanitarian organizations who are working in Rakhine State, their difficulty is, how much do you push on the advocacy side and lose access to, to people who are in an incredibly dire situation. And there is lobbying that should be done perhaps at higher levels of, of the United Nations and other parts of the international community. And to some extent that's being done, but I do feel that, Mark is right, there has been a kind of a backsliding and a little bit of softening on this side. Although I have to say that I did notice that the Secretary General did mention the word Rohingya in his statement to the partnership meeting on Myanmar, which just took place a few days ago on the sidelines of the General Assembly. So that at least was a little bit of encouragement. But, as Mark said, we shouldn't be here talking about who's going to be brave enough to use the word Rohingya. You have to get to more fundamental issues than that, both on the humanitarian side, the human rights side, and also really, trying to look at possible ways of somehow resolving some of these very, fundamental problems for the long term. And, looking at the plan, the way this is written up, I really don't see the logic at all of, presenting a plan like this and somehow thinking that it's going to achieve an objective of, somehow being able to create an environment of tolerance and peace. You're doing nothing to actually address the root causes of that.
What would happen if the Rohingya did sign up to this plan? I mean, there's not much chance that they're going to, but if they did, what would happen to them? What would be the practical consequences?
Well, this is the thing as well. I really think that, there's a real illusion that somehow by dropping the term Rohingya and not addressing these people as the way they want to be addressed, that the problems will go away. I mean, that's just not true. I really do think the violence will remain. I think the tensions will remain because there are much more deep-seated problems than the use of a name, right? The use of the term that it's not about classifications, right? It's about racism. It's about, this idea that, the Rohingya are immigrants. It's these kinds of issues. It's about who's indigenous and who's not to Burma. What does being a Burmese mean? It's much deeper issues about what Burmese nationality, Myanmar nationality, what this vision of citizenship and nationhood actually should even look like. And I think that unless you're working on ways to address those issues, no matter what you decide to call a particular population, that's not going to solve your problem, right? It's not just about reclassifying in a way that people will suddenly accept them. That's just not going to happen. I mean, even if they call themselves Bengali, it won't improve things.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, that's true, isn't it? It's a symbolic thing, but it would be a symbolic thing which could lead to much greater degrees of racism and discrimination.
Well, I think what some Rohingya people have been saying is, how can people defend our rights if they're not even willing and able to use our name? I think so. It's a key starting point. But I think, what Lilianne is saying about the sort of nationalism within society in Burma is really important because it's not just about the Rohingya. What we saw was anti-Muslim, anti-Rohingya sentiment in 2012, which then expanded into violence against non-Rohingya Muslims all over the country, with the proposal of laws which will not only try to limit the rights and of Muslim people within Burma, but will also affect Christians. So, this is about a deeper-seated problem and
so
nationalism.
You're saying really
within
there's
Burma.
a kind of very strong general chauvinism in the state machine, really.
Very much so, yes, within all levels of society, yes. I mean, and within the main opposition NLD party and other sort of democracy activists, as well as within the military and the pro-military backed government. It's endemic within the society there. And I think the Rohingya are just the tip of the iceberg. They're, some of the most unpopular people in the country, but what we're seeing targeted against them, we're also seeing spread to other people. And this is the kind of issue which has plagued Burma since independence, and why the country has had conflict since independence, and why it had dictatorship in the first place was a central government, a military that was unable to accept Burma as a multi-ethnic, multi-religious country.
OK, Mark, Lilianne, thank you very much for that discussion. But I'm afraid that's all we've got time for in this episode of The Report. I want to thank all my guests on today's show and to thank you at home for watching. Do remember that you can keep up with us on Twitter by following @IslamChannel and by using the hashtag #TheReport. We'll be back tomorrow evening at the same time. But for now, we'll leave you with some footage from the Ukrainian city of Kharkov, where on Sunday a large crowd gathered to witness the toppling of a statue of former Soviet leader Vladimir Lenin. Perhaps Lenin wouldn't have minded. He once said, "Statues are for pigeons." Until tomorrow night, good night.